I have John Dall'Aglio with me, who is you're a PhD student at Duquesne, right? Studying clinical psychology. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
All right. And your book, which I picked up, which I really love, A Lacanian Neuropsychoanalysis, Consciousness Enjoying Uncertainty, is kind of what turned me on to your work. And I'm really excited to have you here today. So let's just get into it and see where the conversation goes. Can you provide a high-level understanding for the audience about Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis? So I'm doing this season on neuropsychoanalysis, just kind of in general, dipping back into Solms's work and kind of tracing it from Paanksepp and some of the early neurophilosophical stuff from the 80s. So what kind of brought you here? Well, actually, let's get into that in a second. Let's just start with, high-level Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis. Who's Lacan? Why psychoanalysis? What's neuropsychoanalysis?
Sure. So, yeah, it's kind of exciting to hear that you're doing kind of like a return to some of the neuropsychoanalysis and neurophilosophy stuff on the podcast. And I think one way to think about this, like what is Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis, is what would be a particularly Lacanian take on neuroscience and on the work in neuropsychoanalysis. So Lacan, Jacques Lacan, he was a French psychoanalyst from mainly sort of very like theoretically active and like between the 40s, 50s through to the 80s. And his work, he integrated a lot of things. He integrated a lot of different disciplines, including philosophy and structural linguistics into psychoanalysis. And one of his big deals with Freud was his famous return to Freud was this argument that we need to sort of go back to Freud's texts and read them very carefully. Read them to the letter, as some people put it. But to argue that a lot of what Freud was saying, and I think this is maybe helpful, and in part it's kind of what got me into Lacan myself, that a lot of the sort of pop understandings of Freud and some ways of interpreting Freud that I don't necessarily disagree with, to be honest, but there are ways that have kind of got rigidified, that, you, the naughty child, has all these Oedipal fantasies. You want to sleep with one parent, kill the other parent. So Lacan went back to this and he said, well, if you read what Freud's saying at a slightly higher level of abstraction, that a lot of what Freud talks about is in another way talking about these sort of different relationships between different things, different sort of logical relationships. So, the issue around, rather than, I want to sleep with my mom and kill my dad, rather it's about a certain pleasure or enjoyment with someone that's too close or maybe taboo, and an issue relating to prohibition, what is socially not acceptable. And once you kind of abstract it to that level, it becomes a little less concretized, and a little more, in my view, applicable to multiple other situations that don't have to be in this sort of rigid explanation. So that's just one example of the many, many different things that Lacan did with Freud's work. And so what Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis is taking some of Lacan's ideas, especially these more, at least from my work in it, some of the more abstract ideas, and maybe we'll get into some of those. But reading some of the neuropsychoanalytic work through that lens, reading research in neuroscience, especially affective neuroscience and computational neuroscience from this perspective of Lacanian psychoanalysis, and sort of what can come of that. What were the similarities? What are some of the differences there?
Yeah, that's very cool. And like, how about you personally? You talk about it a little bit in the book, but kind of what drew you to that in terms of your curiosity?
Yeah, so just to sort of continue with the Lacan piece of it, I had first encountered Lacan when I was an undergrad. I was fortunate to take a class on Freud, Lacan, and feminist theory, and a lot of it had to do with this way, because I really liked Freud, and then what I liked especially about Lacan was the way that he read Freud, where it becomes less about some of the particular explanations or interpretations, like kind of what I just gave regarding like the Oedipus example, and it makes it honestly the way I kind of think about it is kind of like in math where you have variables like x plus y equals whatever, and becomes less about the particular things you fill in the variables with, so much
Mhm.
as like what are the formulas?
Yeah.
What are the different formulas that one can extract from Freud's work? What are the sort of formulas we might live by or patterns we might live by? And then you can fill in those variables with different things. That's kind of one of the ways I understood Lacan, and I really liked it because it appealed to me as making Freud a bit more flexible for the 21st. That's the century we're in. Yeah, for the 21st century.
Like a lot of Freud stuff got throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? Some of the perspectives that seemed almost like his personal experiences, his personal applications. But if you take, as you mentioned, the philosophical approach and the neurological approach that he was taking, you don't want to get rid of all of it, right? There's stuff that is still very profound and useful when we're looking at the brain in modern times, right?
Exactly, and a lot of things that are quite surprising. They were maybe Freud was more on track than a lot of people would have anticipated.
Yeah.
And so the just to say the neuropsychoanalysis part of it. So I say a bit about this in the book, but at the end of high school, I was in a seminar on very like introductory level to psychology, neuroscience, and some theology stuff. And the seminar was taught by the school's clinical psychologist. And he was kind of like old school trained back in the like I want to say the 60s when a lot of training was still very psychodynamic Freudian. So the psychology we read was basic sort of ego psychology Freud. And I just really liked it. I thought there was something cool about thinking about the mind in conflict. There's something appealing to it, something that made a lot of sense to me when I was in high school. And when we got to the neuroscience part of it, we learned about basically, generally different brain areas and how you've got some more quote unquote emotional brain areas that maybe react in the flight or fight way. Versus other brain areas that, when they're more active, quote unquote, you can act more rationally or make clearer decisions. And just hearing this, I thought, gosh, that sounds vaguely similar to like id and ego, like just at a very superficial level. So I was like, I'm going to Google neuroscience psychoanalysis. And then I discovered, I didn't know there's this entire field called neuropsychoanalysis, and I've been captivated with it ever since. And so, yeah, that's kind of where those two pieces came from. And as I continued reading neuropsychoanalysis stuff in college, while I was also taking these Lacan classes, I was sort of just naturally thinking about them together, thinking about how one might be applying to the other.
Yeah, very cool. And I mean, I think that's what has drawn me to psychoanalysis too, is just a very robust conceptualization of the mind that is still used even in pieces and other modalities from a clinical perspective, right? You're still drawing on a lot of this stuff, so still very useful. And as you mentioned, the brain in conflict, or the move, and also the dynamic part of it, the moving brain. And one thing I wanted to ask you about, because when I read it in your book, it was one of those light bulb moments for me. So I've been considering a lot of what I call this negative principle in philosophy. So certain philosophical systems that don't say what is, but allude to what isn't. So in postmodern perspectives, it's all about these gap between epistemological systems. In Derridian thought, like the trace of a word, not what's written, but what might happen after you've read it. Things like this negative, and then of course Zizek's work with the conflict being the real. So you bring this out in your book, and you relate it to two philosophical or neurophilosophical concepts. One is there is no homeostasis of homeostasis, and the other is there is cerebral non-rapport, or there is no cerebral rapport. Can you maybe dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, and just to satisfy my obsessional desires, these are I can't claim any of these little axioms. No homeostasis of homeostasis. I've taken from a colleague, Ariane Bazin, who has shared the phrase with me. And there is cerebral non-rapport. It's a spin on a phrase from Adrian Johnston. So a lot of, especially the philosophy stuff, I build very heavily on work, especially from Slavoj Žižek and Adrian
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Johnston in particular. But basically, it's looking at we have all these ideas of nature, and kind of every day, we talk about evolution, we talk about sort of adaptation, and there are these general assumptions we have or senses we have that evolution is sort of designing things, or survival of the fittest sort of idea. And one of the points, and there's actually a really great book on this by Daniel Milo called Good Enough. I highly recommend it. But it's to point out that evolution is not a dog breeder. And I didn't know this, but Darwin was actually highly influenced by dog breeding at the time in Britain when he was writing Origin of the Species. He references dog breeding more than he references the finches, apparently.
Wow.
So this idea that sort of like the brain like evolved to do blank, or the brain evolved to be like a highly adaptive, super configured master control system. That's a certain view of nature. It's a certain view of nature that of what I call capital N nature, an all-determining, sort of well worked out nature, where things like pathology, things like suffering, things like diseases, those are somehow deviations from what nature is trying to be, sort of like the norm of nature, so to speak. Versus this other view of nature, which I take from these philosophical positions. It's a view of nature that it's not capital N nature. It's a sort of quote unquote weak nature, or also a nature barred. Sometimes I put it that way in the book. And the idea being that nature is not a perfect designer. There isn't nature as the invisible hand of an intelligent designer. There's a great example in the Good Enough book of giraffes, for example, have an incredibly high infantile morbidity rate. Because giraffes are very tall, because they have really long legs. So when the giraffe gives birth, the infant falls from a pretty high height of maybe like 6 feet or something. So there's a high infantile morbidity rate because they die from falling from up so high.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, giraffes are still alive. And nevertheless, giraffes are still quite tall and they still have the long legs. So nature has a very, very low bar for things to get by. You only need to live long enough to reproduce. That's all you need to do.
Yeah.
As long as you're good enough to reproduce, that's it. In terms of the minimum bar of nature. If you die before that, then yes, your genes don't get passed on. But if you live long enough to reproduce, and the evidence for this, we have so many genetic diseases, we have so many things that are inherited that aren't lethal enough to kill us before we reproduce. And that's all that nature minimally asks us for. And what this does is it creates within nature the space or opportunity for lots of randomness, for lots of errors, for lots of chance uncertainties, for lots of things that are less than perfect to nevertheless get into nature. For things that are less than perfect, for things that are not necessarily getting along with each other, with things that are inconsistent or rubbing up against each other to still get passed down. And the idea is that the brain is one of those things. The brain isn't a unified organ that is perfectly in harmony with itself, that actually the brain is antagonistic. The brain has kind of conflict within it. And that's one of the ways that I think about the negative. Not that, oh, there's something that we can't grasp in the brain. No, just the brain is itself not, if there are different homeostatic systems in the brain, there isn't a meta homeostasis of how do I perfectly resolve all of this.
There you go. Yeah, yeah. Which is important to me, and if you follow my podcast, this is coming away from dogmatic religion, which sort of gives these answers. And I think it's sometimes a logical step for folks to then subscribe to a capital N nature, right? This oneness, and even psychedelic thought and stuff is kind of about this oneness too. But this is almost it's an overarching principle, but it's one of conflict and non-resolution, which is a different perspective. And you also, when it comes to neuroscience, right, you can't see this conflict necessarily when you're scanning the brain, and these gaps between the systems, these systems that are attempting but not finding homeostasis. This is not always easily grasped with neuroscientific instruments. Am I getting that right?
Um, I'm not a super expert on brain imaging techniques, but I mean, brain imaging, from my understanding of it, and I have done studies in brain imaging, that it's not something that there are particular experimental paradigms. Like you don't get you never get a naked view of the brain. The brain is always interacting with stuff.
Mhm.
And there are different areas of the brain that activate relatively different to different conditions. So I'm talking about some functional magnetic resonance imaging, for example, where you have different experimental conditions and you contrast between conditions to see which brain areas were relatively more active than not active. The brain is never not doing anything. The brain is always doing something, all parts of it, all the time. It's never, areas don't just turn off unless it's damaged by stroke. But that's to say that I think that, and maybe this relates to how I really emphasize viewing things in neuropsychoanalysis, it's that there would be some cases to see conflict in the brain where you have sort of different relative areas of activity that perhaps, if those are associated with different kinds of responding or interpreting of information, that you can see that difference. So for one example, this isn't brain imaging, but this principle same applies. There's a thing in the psych research literature on avoidance attachment. Avoid where seemingly in response to separation or rejection, folks with avoidant attachment, unlike the anxious attachment folks who get really anxious about the rejection, they're kind of distant. They seemingly don't attend to it. They kind of distance themselves. Now, one might think that, oh, they just don't care as much. They're not as bothered by the distress as the anxious attachment folks are. But when you actually take galvanic skin responses, so a measure of arousal, measuring sort of electromuscular activity in the skin, but I'd be willing to bet, and I'm sure there is research in terms of brain activity during the situations as well, they are actually quite reactive. They are very much aroused. They're just not behaving it out. It's maybe suppressed. It's maybe, avoided in some way. So there are ways to see the conflict. And this is what I emphasize, and maybe against the idea of sort of a oneness, it's not as if seeing the conflict in the brain tells us an answer. Like we from the subjective side of things, we have these conceptualizations of negativity, of conflict, of antagonism. And from a neuropsychoanalytic perspective, we should also be able to see these things on the objective side in terms of how we build the world of objects, to image it, see it in the brain, abstract it in terms of computational formulas as well. That doesn't provide an answer to it. That doesn't get rid of the conflict or the gaps or anything. It gives us other ways of thinking about it, other ways of approaching it. But these are two sides of the same coin. So I think I don't think it would be impossible to have some way of conceptualizing gaps or negativity in terms of brain imaging, in terms of behavioral research, but it's another data point. It's another point of convergence. It's not saying, oh, then you just turn this area off to make things all go.
And then you're good. Yeah, if only it were so easy.
Right. Exactly.
Now, again, you quote a lot from Solms, obviously, in your book, and also you bring in Friston's work, which, to do with active inference, excuse me. And, this idea that we're either acting on the world or changing belief systems. The brain does that too, with certain statistical inferences in between there at that juncture. But part of what you mentioned about a Lacanian approach to neuropsychoanalysis would be to provoke prediction error. Can you explain that a little bit? What is it? What would it mean? And what would that look like clinically to provoke a prediction error?
So yeah, the idea is essentially the brain is an inference machine from this perspective. And the brain is, because it's not in direct contact with the world, it has to keep us alive minimally. So it has to learn how to deal with the world and has to make sense of all the ambiguities in the world, of which there are many. It also has a lot of its own systems, and this is the Paanksepp stuff in terms of the affective neuroscience, that it also has to meet in their own terms. Not only hunger, and thirst, more basic biological needs, but at the same time, the emotional drives that Paanksepp talks about, for example, fear, needing to stay safe from threat, rage, needing to remove obstacles to one's goals, seeking, needing to engage with novelty. And so basically what happens is, and there are all of these different systems in the brain, and part of the weak nature, not capital N nature view of the brain, is that these systems are necessarily in conflict with each other. So, for example, let's say with the attachment example, you have a need to stay close to caregivers. When you separate from the caregiver, then this causes a certain kind of anxiety, separation distress, and then that provokes you to, cry, wow, mommy, you left, or, the child crying when the parent leaves. And then the goal of that is to motivate the child to, get back to the attachment figure because it's dangerous to be separated from one's caregivers, especially when one's very young. So systems have a very good reason that they survived evolution. On the other hand, when the caregiver is frustrating or maybe at the same time gets in the way of your goals, or if the caregiver at the same time maybe is felt to be threatening or overbearing or aggressive in a certain way, you have other drives that enter as well. So for example, if you get frustrated, the impulse with rage is to attack and destroy the frustrating object. And then you have the problem, oh no, if I destroy the object, then that means that I'm going to be separated from the object, and suddenly we have conflict, back in classical Freudian conflict. And so what this means is the brain is going to have to sort of cut its losses and lay down patterns and solutions that are less than perfect, because to fully perfect and solve everything is impossible. Again, this sort of weak nature view of the brain. And so what happens is these certain patterns in psychoanalysis, these are symptoms, these sort of basic habitual ways of dealing with the inevitable conflicts and feelings that are left over in affective consciousness. Those get laid down and they get automatized. They become habitual patterns because we learn them very early on, and they're the best that we have. It's the best of a bad job that's impossible to do perfectly anyway. And then the goal clinically is to try to invite and provoke some sort of surprise, some sort of something unexpected that allows there to be some level of distance and change in these patterns that we typically engage in. And so there's a lot of neuroscience research on changing memories, memory reconsolidation, that shows that surprise is necessary for memory reconsolidation. So to update memories, there has to be something new that you encounter when the memory is reactivated. And the same logic applies, in my view, in not only many clinical techniques, not only psychoanalytic, but many clinical techniques, but especially Lacanian techniques, where there are these different kinds of interventions that are meant to introduce some uncertainty. They're meant to sort of problematize what this person's either assumptions were, what their expectations were, and in doing so, it makes these deeply automatized patterns come to the fore. It makes these sort of basic assumptions we have come to the surface, and it allows us to play with them a little bit. It allows us to sort of inject some uncertainty to see, okay, what looseness can one maybe open here? And it doesn't necessarily feel playful all the time, but what looseness can be opened here that can create the opportunity for some kind of change.
Yeah. Okay. And so this is where like jouissance comes in, I think, when it comes to the affective neuroscience. So like, if we could take it to the level of the brain, we're talking about like neural systems for affect. And Solms talks about how the sort of mismatch of these systems is what creates affective consciousness. And in your work, you suggest that jouissance plays a role here now when these two affective systems are mismatching. So what is that neuroscientifically from your work?
Yeah, so and this is where I think the Lacanian consilience with Solms's work is really surprising, because Solms is not Lacanian, just to be clear. But he argues that the necessary conditions for affective consciousness, which he reviews a ton of research to see that this is the basic form of consciousness in his interpretation. And what you need for that is actually for things to not be perfectly predicted, to not be perfectly worked out. And that the functional role of affect is to, I love the phrase he uses, to feel one's way through one's predictions. So we have different inferences about the world. What happens is they don't work. So, for example, to go back to the child caught between rage and separation distress, let's say the child's automatized solution is do nothing. Do nothing because if I attack the caregiver, then that means that the caregiver might leave. So if I do nothing, if I'm good, if I shut up, if I don't say anything, then this will sustain the attachment bond. One can see how not only is that not a very good solution for rage, because then, well, where's the rage going to go? But quite frankly, doing nothing isn't a good solution for everything. Doing nothing, it's not a very good solution for all of the systems that one has.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, this is what happens. And inhibitiveness is a relatively common clinical trend, you know? So to go back to that, if this is what's happening, yes, you have laid this down as, okay, this is what I'm going to do to deal with uncertainty. This is what I'm going to do to deal with the leftover feelings that I haven't solved. Well, if you keep doing that, it's going to keep not working. You're going to repeat it again and again, and you're going to keep rousing error signals because there's a mismatch. If I don't do something about my anger, that does not solve the anger. Therefore, I still feel anger. And if I do not do anything, then I don't sustain more attachment bonds, and then that leads to me feeling more depressed, for example. So one will continue to have consciousness only because one's predictions do not perfectly fit the bill. Only because, again, total homeostasis is impossible. So you only get consciousness, when I read Solms this way, you only get consciousness because there is conflict. Because there is conflict in nature. And this is where I situate jouissance. That jouissance is the excess of affective consciousness that is not explained. It's the excess of affect that hasn't been fully resolved or dealt with, that is left over and sort of still sort of begging to be dealt with. And yes, we have our symptomatic ways of dealing with it where we maybe relegate it off to something, and we all do that. But that sort of leftover of affective consciousness, that leftover of prediction error, that's the area that is kind of, in my view, kind of getting targeted when we think about provoking prediction error. When we think about using surprise and uncertainty, that's what we're trying to harness because that's where the space for change is.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any idea of, like, again, when we're talking about the material of the brain, jouissance? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about dopamine tagging, but any other ideas there? And maybe I didn't catch it in the book, but in terms of what that looks like, you know, these conflicting affect systems, and then how this little bit of extra, or is this just conceptual? Is it just a conceptual idea?
I think it's something that there is, and I do mention the dopamine system because there is, from at least what I've reviewed, more research to sort of think about that dynamic in particular. And I like that one because it's very well established in the addictions literature. Addictions literature. It's very well researched in terms of, you know, this is the classic thing about the rat with the electrode in the certain part of the hypothalamus, keeps pressing the button until it dies, because it rather would press the button to get that stimulation, the same stimulation that you get from things like cocaine, methamphetamines, and things like that. And so it's sort of a clear prime example of jouissance, pleasure that goes beyond homeostasis, so much to the point of death. Now, what I like, again, about the Lacan part of this is that when you think about it at this level of conceptual abstraction, then it's, okay, what other brain systems could possibly be doing a similar function, perhaps with different dynamics than the particular neurodynamics of the dopamine system, but at the same time, different kinds of excitation, different kinds of this sort of logic of excess. And in the book, I mention other areas of research. There's areas of research in central sensitization in chronic pain syndromes, where certain circuits get excited and sort of are hypersensitized in their own repetition, where there's sort of this again, a repetition beyond its own activity that may or may not feel good. Again, it's a pleasure that doesn't necessarily feel pleasurable as such. And I think one of the things that is helpful with the Karl Friston work here is that, and Solms's integration with the Paanksepp as well, is that these aren't particular isolated brain circuits, that all of these systems, they're neuromodulatory systems. So each system bathes the brain in different sort of different relative patterns of different neuromodulators, like dopamine, but also serotonin, acetylcholine, histamine, norepinephrine, adrenaline, all of these sorts of things. And all of these neuromodulators are adjusting things throughout the entire brain. So I don't think there's like a brain area for jouissance. It's the entire brain in a very dynamic sense, that all of the different things the brain is doing at multiple levels, the relative activity, the weights afforded to those are adjusted based on which different systems are active. And when certain dynamics are in play, it's more of a sort of brain-wide event. So I don't think there's like a jouissance area, but are areas more important? Yes.
Yeah. And I think one thing you mentioned is how the play circuit comes in. And almost as if there could be sort of maladaptive ways that jouissance could manifest in the brain, and also adaptive ways that the play system could come and play there.
Okay, yeah. So I think, especially from a Lacanian perspective, one of the unique things, or it's not unique, but one of the emphases that really gets made is that adaptive, maladaptive, we need to be very specific, that it's not something that from like an external perspective, like I judge this person's behavior to be maladaptive. Maybe I do, but that's not the sort of clinical position that the therapist or analyst would take. It's that, at least the way that I think about it, adaptive, maladaptive is viewed from the perspective of the patient, from the person. That we all, as I've said, if we begin from this idea of the brain is necessarily in conflict, necessarily imperfect, therefore any habit or pattern we lay down is necessarily not going to fully work. In other words, is necessarily symptomatic. It's necessarily a symptom. There is no getting rid of symptoms.
That's right.
Symptoms it's our unique solutions to the impossibilities of life that we're unfortunately dealt with. And well, fortunately, because at least we get to be conscious, although if that's fortunate or not, who knows? But nevertheless, we have them. And what becomes maladaptive is when someone's, I call it a mode of jouissance in the book, basically someone's sort of habitual way of dealing with this kind of necessary excess of feeling. If one's habitual way of doing that creates too much suffering for them. And that's the point at which they might judge it to be maladaptive, or, immediate people in their life whose then their judgments of it might be disturbing to them. So we may not be directly aware that, oh, what I'm doing is bad for me. Maybe it has to sort of come through other people that we care about. But nevertheless, it's something that one does consciously or unconsciously that causes one to suffer and to seek help, basically. And the way that I view play, it is more in the way that Solms talks about play, which is it's a little distinct from at least the basic neuroscience research on the play drive in the literature, that it's not just rough and tumble play, where if you see like, the dog, if you have two dogs, what do? They play together, one chases the other, then they switch, and the other one chases the other one, then they go back and forth. Maybe one pins the other, then they run, the other one pins the other one, they play. It is that, but it's not only that. And the way that Solms talks about the play drive is that it's in some ways a meta system and a space to work out solutions or conflicts between the other systems without it getting essentially too real. So, for example, hide and seek. Yeah, especially if you remember when you were a kid playing hide and seek, you there's a little fear thrill in running away from
Mhm.
whoever's it. There is a little kind of anxiety. It's not actual terror of someone chasing you with a knife. But it's a way of dealing with that. I did myself martial arts as a kid, and there's a difference between being really, in fact, furious and attacking someone, and doing martial arts sparring. But it's a way of playing out or playing with these different not only feelings but then also ideas in an as if or a symbolic way. And one of the things that happens in therapy is it's essentially thinking of an analysis or any kind of therapy as a play space. Play, and again, in this capital sense of not necessarily feeling playful, but it's, I'm talking about what I'm doing, or I'm thinking or trying to explore through what I'm doing without hopefully necessarily enacting it and sort of just doing it. It's to create, to think, okay, problematize what's going on here, or what am I saying here. I just said this about this situation with another person where they did something that made me react in a certain way, and you're taking a certain step, or maybe the therapist highlights a certain word that you used that maybe stands out, and then that causes some uncertainty that you think about, that you explore. What could this be? What
Mm.
might this be? What might it be currently, or what might it be in the future, without it sort of exploding into something totally crazy? And this is why it's a balance between, especially in situations of trauma or PTSD, the use of uncertainty and surprise. It's not to re-traumatize the patient,
Mhm. Yeah.
which that doesn't lead to any help. It's to sort of introduce enough uncertainty that allows for this playful, quote unquote, exploration, this sort of exploration of the patterns, of the feelings, without it becoming the actual person coming at you with the knife. It's playing tag in a way.
Yeah. And so then this would sort of lead to the remetabolism of jouissances, or yeah. So again, can you speak to that, like physiologically, or in the brain, like what that remetabolism looks like? Or yeah.
So again, I think the remetabolism, if and I wouldn't know, I would love someone to tell me how to design an experiment to image this in the brain. But yeah, I think it would be something that's very brain wide. I don't think it's something that would be sort of localized to like a specific set of areas, maybe some more than others. And again, it would probably have especially to do with these emotional circuits, that because the change is coming, it's not oh, I sit back and I think like, okay, yes, this is how I'm going to change my life, and then I go about and doing it.
Yeah.
It's not a simple kind of high level philosophical exercise. And this is why again I like the idea of jouissance, the hitch, the sort of a point that's targeted isn't to think through. It's a hit on feeling. It's a kind of feeling of surprise that drives the change. That's surprise is what's necessary for the change to happen, not just problem solving reflection. That's why psychoanalysis is not an education lesson. It's not learning what to do. It's opening space for surprise, and therefore neurophysiologically most likely activity in more deeper emotional circuits in the brain, the basic sort of emotional upper brainstem limbic structures that Paanksepp documents, in addition to changes elsewhere that are driven by that, at the very least, I would say. But the idea being that these sort of openings are created, and the space then to see, okay, what is getting repeated? How is it getting to repeat differently? Or to, as Freud puts it, to bring the ego to a position as to choose with respect to the conflict that it's dealing with, and how it is dealing with it. It's not forcing the patient one way or the other, but it's to open that opportunity. And to give just an example of it, because this isn't something that is again, when I use the word play, some people might think it's kind of like a fun thing to do. It might not. And yes, hopefully therapy does feel fun at times, but it isn't necessarily going to feel playful all the time. There's a great play actually, good wordplay, play. There's a great play I saw recently, an Arthur Miller play, The Price. I hadn't seen it before, but just to give a quick synopsis of it, it's a man with a brother. The father has just passed away, and he and the brother have inherited the father's like large Manhattan apartment, I think, and they're like trying to figure out. They're trying to sell the apartment and all the stuff in it, and then there's like this a guy that comes in who's offering money for it, and the brother who's in charge of the selling had taken care of the father, who sunk into a deep depression after losing all his money in the Great Depression, and was sort of a shell of a man. And this one son felt sort of responsible for caring for the father. He kind of gave up his hopes to be a scientist to stay at home and work a police job and care for the father. Whereas the other brother didn't stay home. The other brother went to medical school, became a successful doctor and everything. And what happens over the course of the play, so basically this one brother, the first brother, he's kind of built his identity or lots of his life around, I've given up this to care for my father. And, what else could I do? I had to care for him. This was my responsibility as a son. And what happens over the course, especially the second act of the play, the brother gradually reveals that the father actually still had a lot of money. The father actually still had a ton of money. He just wasn't spending it. He was in a depression, and who knows why the father wasn't spending it. But it's kind of this huge shock moment for the first brother, where it's like, well, what happened? Was my entire narrative a lie? Was what I was doing a lie? I sacrificed all this. Like, what do you mean he still had money? And it's this huge sort of like revelation for him. And I think it's a good example of the kind of what I mean by sort of problematizing these deeply held assumptions about how we constitute our lives. These deeply held patterns that aren't just behavioral patterns like doing nothing, but they're sort of patterns with which we construct our entire history, our entire perception of the world, our sense of ourself. And when those things get questioned, as they would in an analysis, that sort of shock, that opening there, that's the sort of intensity of jouissance. That is, on the one hand, devastating and destituting, but on the other hand, it creates the space, okay, now what? It creates the sort of space for something new to emerge.
Yeah.
And that is on the side of the invention of the patient then.
Yeah. Yeah. I like this idea, and maybe I made it up in my mind, which was that maybe this play circuit was like a mediating circuit, right? When this disruption that is affective consciousness comes about, there's this recurring symptom which has been automatized. That this play, as you mentioned, surprise, which isn't necessarily playful, is this way of sort of bringing back the homeostasis. Now you see my bent towards bringing things back into homeostasis. But I don't know. Any thoughts about that? Am I onto something there, or am I off track?
No, I think so, because it's not like we want to live in complete uncertainty. In fact, we don't. The brain, where the way that what we have gotten from evolution is to solve uncertainty, but it's to, in these moments where there is something that is getting repeated and automatized, you find a different way to repeat it. You find a new solution that still keeps that uncertainty going, but maybe plays it out differently. And so, I mean, one example could very well be, let's, this is a stupid example, but, someone, let's say, who has a ton of anger problems, and their problem is the fact that they keep acting out anger, and one can imagine how that is not adaptive for many life situations and relationships. Let's say this person becomes a martial artist. Let's say that this person becomes a sports player. Let's say that there's someone who has a symptom of maybe a more like obsessional kind of symptom of really thinking again and again and ruminating on these particular details and trying to sort out contradictions, or like with these situations like, oh, but that doesn't fit with that, and trying to sort things out, you could be a wonderful philosopher in terms of, thinking through metaphysics and these sorts of things. And my examples are maybe intellectualizing and stuff, and there are other things too. I mean, another person might be maybe an automatized pattern could be maybe deferring to the other. Sort of catering to the other person and sort of effacing oneself. Well, this person might be excellent as is a clinician.
Yeah, careful
one whose profession or one whose work is
yeah.
care for others. Exactly.
Yeah.
So
and I think
there are these patterns that play it out differently.
Yeah. One of your points was enjoying your enjoyment. And even the title of the book, Enjoying Uncertainty, this idea that there's a version of that, uncertainty and these symptoms that work. Very cool. So
yeah, I think, and this one. Oh yeah, and this is one cool thing that comes in computational research from Karl Friston too, where there's like research on the neurodynamics in music, for example, and they find that music, sort of the enjoyment of music, as most people have some kind of music they enjoy listening to, that it's not sort of when because you can operationalize uncertainty in the brain. Enjoying music is not a total flattening of uncertainty. There's a certain pattern to the uncertainty, but there nevertheless is uncertainty there. And sort of music is sort of predicted uncertainty. In terms of the rhythm, in terms of the thing that drives the enjoyment there. And I don't think that lens of music is very far off from what one does in a therapy.
Yeah, very cool. So let's go back, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, but in terms of this idea of mapping or attempting to map philosophical systems, in this case psychoanalysis, but other philosophical systems to the brain. And you put it in your book, which was new to me, and I read it later actually in Solms stuff, but the idea of it, these are neuroscientific abstractions is the way to approach it, so as not to sort of concretize any of this. But what is the value of doing it as a philosophical practice?
I think that, and I think there's a risk, and again, this is why I think that philosophy and psychoanalysis is just as important as neuroscience, if maybe not more important in some ways, because especially the way that the brain is taken up now, it's very easy to inject lots of fantasies into it, as if, we can solve everything, by understanding the brain. Neuroeconomics, neuroeducation, neuropedagogy, neuro this, neuro that, as if the neuroscience research will tell us how to fix it. Neuropolitics, biopolitics was the phrase, for Foucault and everything.
Yeah.
From this, yes, it's just another set of abstractions. Right, exactly. Neuro leadership, as if people who aren't leaders don't have brains, and so what comes from this is to think that the abstractions from neuroscience, they give us new ways and new ideas to think with, alongside other systems that we also think with. And it's to basically consider new possibilities of how things relate to each other. And so just to give one example, for a long time in terms of both philosophy and also psychoanalysis, there is memory. We have memories. From neuroscience research, especially research on brain damage, we find that there's actually many different kinds of memory systems, many different kinds of memory, both sort of unconscious memories that literally cannot be rendered conscious in a reflective fashion. Also memories that we can render conscious in a reflective fashion. Emotional memories, motor memories, personal memories, factual memories. And these are all dissociable to relatively distinct brain circuits, or at least the brain's areas that they're necessarily dependent on. Mm-hmm. And so from my perspective, okay, we get these different abstractions from neuroscience, different kinds of memory. We get this from doing brain damage research. And then we go back to psychoanalysis. How do we update and revise our psychoanalytic ways of thinking, now that we can think, oh, there's more than one kind of memory, that these are actually qualitatively distinct, or vice versa. From the Lacanian side of things, there's a recently a couple of years ago, Darian Leader published a critique of the Lacanian concept of jouissance, that it's kind of monolithic, that all feeling is jouissance, and some Lacanian writers kind of reduce everything to jouissance. From the neuroscience lens of it, it's like, oh, well, there's multiple different emotional systems in the brain. What happens when we think about those different emotional systems, not just one system like jouissance? And then, I mean, and what I kind of try to do in the book is, well, then you get, yes, there are categorically distinct multiple emotional systems, but all of them can be deregulated in the way that jouissance is excessive. That you sort of meet the abstractions in one with the abstractions in the other and see, okay, how does this enrich our thinking? Does this give us new tools to think about what we're seeing in terms of research, what we're seeing clinically? Does it help us conceptualize something differently, to see something that we weren't quite able to see with that level of specificity before?
Wow. Yeah, well put. I mean, and the book is great for that. I already need to go back and read through some of it again to catch some of those points that you brought out. We just talked a little bit about it. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about it. Where's your research taking you now? Like, what are you fascinated by in the moment?
Yeah, so now I guess there's a couple of currently ongoing projects. One is my dissertation, which needs more time than I've been giving it. But it's that project is looking at so one of Solms's hypotheses or arguments from the clinical literature is that different kinds of brain damage can be understood as local regressions from secondary process to primary process in sort of a Freudian system. And so a way of coding and quantifying primary process in sort of speech of interviews of stories told by patients with different kinds of brain damage. And so that's one sort of along a more empirical route. Or at least some quantitative route, and then other sort of ongoing research, so linking Lacanian psychoanalysis to ongoing things. There's a couple papers that are coming out soon, hopefully, expanding Lacan's idea of the unconscious structured like a language, and sort of thinking about this like a language phrase, that what other things are structured like a language without necessarily being language per se. Again, going back to some of the neuroscience research, there are many different brain areas that are very important, and that when they're damaged lead to very drastic clinical phenomena, and not all of those brain areas have to do with necessarily language per se. There are other different kinds of brain systems that are, in my view, structured like a language without being language per se. And then to kind of think about the Lacanian logic of what he calls linguistics applied to other brain systems.
Well, listen, when all that's done, we'll have to have you back on the show. And I'd love to hear more about what you're doing. Really interesting stuff. Thanks a lot for coming on.
I'd be happy to be back. And really, thank you, Tom. And really, it was a pleasure and honor to be here.
Awesome. Let's stay in touch.